The forest always whispers before it screams, but only the people who truly listen ever hear the warning. The first thing Jack Carter noticed was not the smoke. It was the silence. The birds that usually greeted the sunrise had disappeared. The wind that normally carried the scent of pine now felt strangely dry against his face. Even the towering evergreens standing across the mountainside seemed frozen in uneasy anticipation, as though the wilderness itself had paused to take one final breath. Jack stood on a rocky overlook high above the valley with his 10-year-old daughter, Emma, beside him. She adjusted the straps of her small backpack and smiled as she watched the golden morning light spill across the endless forest below. To anyone else, it looked like another beautiful summer day in Northern California. To Jack, something felt wrong. Years of studying nature had taught him that danger rarely announced itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived wrapped inside perfect silence. "Daddy," Emma asked, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair beneath her baseball cap, "why did all the birds disappear?" Jack kept scanning the distant tree line before answering. "Because nature notices changes long before people do." She looked toward the empty sky. "Do you think they know something?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think they always do." Emma had heard answers like that her entire life. Since losing her mother 5 years earlier, every weekend had become another lesson in the outdoors. Jack never believed survival began after disaster. He believed it began years before, in quiet moments when nobody imagined those lessons would ever matter. He had taught Emma how to recognize animal tracks, how to follow the direction of the wind, how to find clean water, and, most importantly, how to stay calm when fear wanted to make every decision for you. She used to think those lessons were simply adventures. Neither of them realized they had been preparing for this day. A faint scent drifted through the warm air. Jack lifted his head. Smoke. Very light. Almost impossible to notice. Emma wrinkled her nose. "Is somebody having a campfire?" Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the western ridge where a thin gray ribbon slowly climbed into the bright blue sky. Then another appeared farther south. The breeze shifted. Within seconds, the smell became stronger. His calm expression never changed, but deep inside, every instinct awakened at once. He reached into his backpack, unfolded a detailed topographic map, and studied the surrounding terrain. "Emma," he said quietly, "I need you to put on your long-sleeve shirt." She obeyed without asking why. That was something Jack admired about her. Trust was never built during emergencies. It was built every ordinary day before they happened. As Emma zipped her lightweight hiking jacket, the wind suddenly changed direction again. A deep rumbling sound rolled across the valley. It was not thunder. It was something heavier, older, endless. They turned together toward the western mountains. A massive wall of smoke rose above the trees, climbing thousands of feet into the sky until it swallowed the sunlight itself. Bright orange flames flickered beneath the thick black clouds, moving across the distant hills with astonishing speed. The fire was no longer far away. It was running with the wind. Emma stared silently at the impossible scene. "Daddy." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Jack rested one steady hand on her shoulder. "Look at me." She did. His eyes remained calm, steady, and completely focused. "The forest is dangerous now, but panic is more dangerous than the fire." She took one slow breath exactly as he had taught her years before. "What do we do?" Jack folded the map carefully and secured it inside his backpack. "We think first." He checked the wind by releasing a handful of dry grass into the air. Every blade drifted sharply east. He looked toward the steep ridges, the narrow canyon below, and the small creek he remembered crossing nearly an hour earlier. Every lesson he had ever learned about surviving in the wilderness suddenly became more valuable than anything money could ever buy. Behind them, another deep roar echoed across the mountains. The smoke thickened. Sunlight faded into an unsettling amber glow. Small pieces of ash floated silently through the air like gray snow. Somewhere far beyond the trees, emergency sirens began to wail, barely audible against the growing voice of the wildfire. Jack reached for Emma's hand. She held it tightly without hesitation. Together they stood on the lonely mountainside as the fire advanced across the horizon, unaware that within the next 12 hours, rescue teams would describe their journey as one of the most remarkable survival stories the Wildfire had ever written. Jack wasted no time after taking Emma's hand. Every second mattered now, but rushing without thinking could be just as dangerous as standing still. He slowly turned in a complete circle, studying every ridge, every slope, every patch of open ground. The Wildfire was still several miles away, but the wind was pushing it with frightening speed. He had seen enough wildfires during his years working with volunteer search and rescue teams to understand one simple truth. Fire rarely moved the way people expected. It followed the wind, climbed steep hills faster than anyone imagined, and created its own weather. Emma looked toward the growing wall of smoke before looking back at her father. "Are we going back to the truck?" she asked quietly. Jack shook his head. "No. The road follows the valley. The fire will reach it before we do if the wind keeps changing." Emma trusted him without hesitation. She nodded once and adjusted the straps on her backpack exactly the way he had shown her during countless hiking trips. Jack smiled softly. Even in frightening moments, she remembered the smallest lessons. He knelt beside her and checked that her water bottle was secure, her hat covered the back of her neck, and her hiking boots remained tightly laced. "Remember our first camping trip?" he asked. Emma managed a small smile. "You told me that the woods are never trying to hurt us." "That is still true," Jack answered. "Nature is not angry. It does not choose victims. We simply have to understand it." He removed the folded topographic map once again and traced a narrow blue line with his finger. A seasonal creek crossed the mountain nearly 1 mile ahead before leading toward an area of exposed granite with very little vegetation. During every family hike, Jack had quietly memorized escape routes without ever mentioning why. It had become second nature after years of teaching outdoor survival classes. Emma noticed him studying the map. "Are we going there?" she asked. Jack pointed toward the rocky slope. "Fire needs fuel. Trees, brush, dry grass. Bare rock does not burn. We're going to reach ground where there is less for the fire to feed on." Emma looked across the forest. The smoke had become thicker now, softening the bright morning into an eerie orange light. Ash floated gently through the air and settled across the pine needles like gray dust. The breeze felt warmer than it had only minutes before. Jack slipped the map back into his backpack and reached for a small compass attached to one shoulder strap. He checked the direction of travel, then looked toward the sun, already dim behind the growing smoke. His breathing stayed slow and steady. Fear clouded judgment. Calm revealed solutions. As they began hiking uphill, Jack deliberately chose uneven rocky terrain instead of the easier trail winding below. Emma noticed immediately. "The trail is faster," she said. "Sometimes the fastest path becomes the most dangerous," Jack replied. "Today we are choosing the safest path." They climbed steadily through scattered boulders where fewer trees grew. Every few minutes Jack stopped to listen. He was not listening for the fire itself. He was listening for the wind. The direction changed again, carrying thicker smoke across the mountainside. Somewhere far behind them, helicopters echoed through the valley, their distant engines fading in and out beneath the constant roar of the growing wildfire. Emma looked toward the sound hopefully. "Do you think they are looking for people?" "Yes," Jack answered honestly. "But right now they cannot see through all the smoke. We have to make good decisions until help can safely reach us." Emma squeezed his hand. "I am glad I came with you." Jack looked down at his daughter with quiet pride. "So am I." They continued climbing until they reached the edge of the seasonal creek. Although only a narrow ribbon of cool water remained, the damp ground nearby held far less dry vegetation than the forest behind them. Jack filled both water bottles before encouraging Emma to drink several careful sips. Little by little, he reminded her. "We do not know how long this will last." She nodded, taking exactly the amount he suggested. They continued following the creek upstream while the forest around them slowly changed. Tall pines became scattered. Thick brush gave way to open stone. The air remained smoky, but visibility improved slightly as the terrain opened beneath the broad mountain sky. Jack glanced over his shoulder one last time. The wildfire had reached the ridge where they had stood less than 30 minutes earlier. Bright flames rolled through the treetops beneath towering columns of smoke, transforming the peaceful overlook into a sea of glowing orange far behind them. Emma quietly slipped her hand into her father's again. Jack gently held it, not because either of them had given up hope, but because every step forward proved that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the quiet decision to keep moving together even when the road ahead could no longer be seen. The farther Jack and Emma climbed, the more the mountains seemed to transform around them. Dense forests slowly gave way to scattered pines, weathered granite, and patches of bare earth that reflected the growing heat. Jack welcomed every stretch of exposed rock because he knew it offered less fuel for the advancing wildfire. Still, the mountain was changing faster than he had expected. The gentle breeze that had greeted them that morning had become a restless current carrying ash across the sky like drifting gray feathers. The sunlight above them no longer looked golden. It had turned into a muted copper glow filtered through layers of smoke that stretched across the horizon. Emma walked beside her father without complaining, carefully placing each boot where he pointed. Every few minutes she glanced toward the valley below. The fire had spread across an astonishing distance in what felt like only moments. Entire hillsides disappeared behind rolling clouds of smoke, while tiny flashes of orange appeared and vanished between the trees. She swallowed quietly before asking, "Is it moving faster?" Jack did not look away from the landscape ahead. "The wind changed again," he answered calmly. "When the wind changes, everything changes." Emma nodded. She had learned long ago that her father never wasted words. If he spoke, every sentence mattered. They continued following the seasonal creek until the narrow stream suddenly divided around a large granite outcrop. Jack stopped immediately. He crouched beside the shallow water and ran his fingers across the damp soil before studying the surrounding vegetation. Small shrubs still held moisture from the creek, while the brush farther uphill looked dry and brittle beneath the unusual heat. He stood quietly for several seconds, listening. Somewhere in the distance came a deep crackling sound carried across the mountain by shifting air currents. It sounded almost like countless dry branches snapping one after another. Emma noticed him concentrating. "What are you listening for?" she asked softly. "The fire tells you where it wants to go," Jack replied. "Sometimes you hear it before you see it." Another gust swept across the ridge. This time the smoke thickened enough to briefly hide the opposite hillside. Jack immediately removed a lightweight bandana from his backpack and dampened it with water from the creek before handing it to Emma. "Cover your nose and mouth if the smoke gets thicker," he said. Then he prepared another one for himself. Emma copied exactly what he did, carefully tying the cloth behind her head. Jack smiled with quiet pride. She no longer needed detailed instructions because years of practice had turned simple survival habits into instinct. They resumed walking, but after another quarter-mile Jack suddenly froze. He slowly raised one hand, signaling Emma to stop without making a sound. She obeyed instantly. Ahead of them, several deer emerged from the trees. Instead of grazing peacefully, they moved quickly across the rocky slope with nervous energy, heading in the same direction Jack had chosen only minutes earlier. None of the animals looked back. Jack watched them disappear beyond the ridge. Emma whispered, "They're running too." Jack nodded. Animals often find safer ground before people understand what is happening. He took one slow breath and adjusted their route slightly to follow the natural contours of the mountain rather than climbing directly upward. The terrain became steeper, but the vegetation grew thinner with every step. Sweat formed along Jack's forehead despite the smoky air, and he noticed Emma beginning to tire. They reached a large granite shelf overlooking a narrow canyon where cool air still drifted upward from the shaded rocks below. Jack set down both backpacks. "We rest for 5 minutes," he said. Emma sat beside him, sipping water exactly as he had taught her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them felt comforting rather than frightening. Finally, Emma looked toward her father. "Were you ever scared when you learned all of this?" Jack looked across the mountains before answering honestly. "Many times." She seemed surprised. "Really?" He smiled gently. "Courage is not about never feeling afraid. Courage is making good decisions while you are afraid. Emma considered those words carefully before giving a quiet nod. Moments later, a distant helicopter appeared briefly through an opening in the smoke. Both of them looked up with hope as it crossed the valley, but within seconds the aircraft disappeared again behind the thick gray haze. Jack understood that the crew could not safely fly wherever visibility vanished. Rescue would take time if it came at all. That meant every decision still depended on them. He stood, lifted both backpacks, and looked toward the broad granite ridge ahead where almost no trees remained. "Ready?" he asked. Emma stood immediately and smiled with determined eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Ready." Together they stepped forward once more, leaving the shelter of the creek behind as the mountain tested every lesson they had ever shared. While above them the smoky sky grew darker and the distant roar of the wildfire rolled steadily closer, like an approaching storm that refused to slow down. Jack studied the broad granite ridge stretching across the mountainside before making another quiet adjustment to their course. The higher they climbed, the fewer trees surrounded them, and that was exactly what he wanted. The wildfire behind them depended on dry brush, fallen branches, and dense forest to keep moving. Here, the landscape offered long stretches of exposed stone interrupted only by scattered patches of low shrubs. It was not completely safe, but it greatly reduced the fire's advantage. Emma followed a few steps behind, matching her father's steady pace. Her breathing had become heavier from the long climb, yet she never complained. Every lesson Jack had patiently taught over the years had prepared her for moments like this. She knew that saving energy was just as important as using it wisely. The mountain rewarded patience far more often than speed. Another warm gust swept across the ridge, carrying fresh ash through the air. Tiny gray flakes drifted around them before settling quietly across the smooth granite. Jack stopped and crouched near the ground. He placed the back of his hand a few inches above the stone, feeling the warmth that had slowly built throughout the day. Then he reached into his backpack and removed a small emergency weather meter no larger than his palm. Emma watched as the tiny fans spun in the breeze. "Checking the wind again?" she asked. Jack smiled. "The wind is writing the story. We just have to keep reading it." He watched the numbers for several seconds before clipping the instrument back onto his pack. The breeze had strengthened slightly, but more importantly, it was still carrying smoke away from the granite ridge instead of directly toward them. That gave them precious time. "We stay on the rock," he said. "As long as we can." They continued across the uneven surface until they reached a narrow gap where the granite sloped gently into another open basin. Beyond it stood a cluster of burned tree trunks from an older wildfire that had swept through years earlier. Most people might have seen only a lifeless landscape, but Jack saw something entirely different. Very little vegetation had returned there, leaving wide sections of open ground with almost nothing left to burn. Emma noticed him smiling for the first time since the smoke appeared. "What is it?" she asked. Jack pointed toward the old burn scar. "Years ago another fire came through here. It already used up most of the fuel." Emma looked carefully at the dark weathered trunks. "So another fire does not have much left?" "Exactly." His voice remained calm and confident. "Sometimes nature leaves behind its own protection." They carefully crossed into the older burned area where the ground became darker but surprisingly open. Small green plants had begun returning between the blackened logs, reminding Jack that forests always found a way to heal. Emma gently touched one tiny pine seedling growing beside an old stump. "It came back," she whispered. Jack nodded. "Life is stubborn. It always looks for another chance." For a brief moment, both of them stood quietly listening. The roar behind them still echoed through the mountains, but it sounded farther away than before. Jack knew better than to celebrate too early. Wildfires could change direction with one unexpected shift in the weather. He looked toward the sky. Thick smoke continued moving overhead, yet a small patch of blue remained visible beyond the eastern horizon. It was enough to remind him that clear air still existed somewhere ahead. Suddenly Emma pointed toward the rocky slope above them. "Look." Jack followed her finger. A family of bighorn sheep moved gracefully across the cliffs, calmly climbing toward higher ground. They showed no signs of panic, only quiet determination as they navigated the steep rocks with remarkable confidence. Jack watched them carefully before smiling again. They know these mountains better than anyone. Emma looked at the animals with admiration. Do you think they're showing us the safest way? Jack considered the question before answering. I think they're reminding us to trust solid ground. They resumed climbing, following the natural path created by the exposed granite rather than forcing their way back into the trees. The air remained smoky, but every step carried them farther from dense vegetation. Hours passed beneath the strange copper sky. They paused only long enough to drink water, eat a small handful of trail mix, and rest in the shade of a large boulder. Jack carefully rationed every supply without making Emma feel worried. She noticed his quiet confidence more than the danger surrounding them, and that confidence slowly became her own. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the mountain rewarded their patience once again. From the top of the ridge, Jack spotted something nearly 2 miles ahead, reflecting a faint glimmer of sunlight through the smoke. He narrowed his eyes before reaching for the compact binoculars hanging from his backpack. A weathered metal roof appeared between scattered rocks near the edge of another open clearing. It was small, isolated, and almost hidden against the mountainside, but it was unmistakably a building. Jack lowered the binoculars and smiled with cautious hope. Emma immediately recognized that expression. You found something. Jack gently squeezed her shoulder. Maybe more than something. If I am right, we just found our next chance. Jack never allowed hope to make him careless. He kept the binoculars raised for several more seconds, carefully studying the small structure resting alone against the mountainside. The metal roof reflected only a faint shimmer through the smoke, but the shape was unmistakable. It was too isolated to be a family cabin and too sturdy to be an abandoned shed. He lowered the binoculars and slowly unfolded the topographic map once again. His finger traced the contour lines until it reached a tiny square printed near the edge of the ridge. A faded label confirmed exactly what he had suspected. It was an old ranger station, one that had not appeared on most modern trail maps for years. Emma leaned closer, curiosity replacing some of the fear that had followed them throughout the afternoon. Can we stay there? She asked. Jack studied the surrounding terrain before answering. If it is still standing, it could give us shelter and maybe even a way to contact someone. He looked toward the smoke drifting above the valley. But we still have to reach it safely. They continued across the broad granite ridge, carefully avoiding patches of dry brush that clung stubbornly to cracks in the stone. Every few hundred feet Jack paused to study the wind, the smoke, and the changing landscape. The old ranger station remained in sight, sometimes disappearing behind rocky outcrops before returning again as they climbed. It became more than a destination. It became a reminder that every careful decision had brought them one step closer to another chance. The air gradually cooled as the sun lowered behind the thick blanket of smoke. The strange copper light softened into deep amber, casting long shadows across the weathered granite. Emma looked toward the fading sky. It feels like evening already. Jack nodded. The smoke is blocking most of the sunlight. We have less daylight than it seems. They increased their pace slightly, but never enough to waste energy. Jack believed that steady movement always lasted longer than desperate rushing. After nearly another hour of careful hiking, they finally reached the edge of the clearing surrounding the ranger station. The small building stood exactly as Jack had hoped. Time had weathered the wooden walls and faded the green paint, yet the roof remained intact. A tall radio antenna still extended above the structure, slightly bent but standing against the smoky sky. Emma smiled for the first time in hours. It is still here. Jack smiled too, though his caution never disappeared. Let us make sure it is safe first. He slowly walked around the outside of the building, checking for signs of damage. The windows remained unbroken. The heavy wooden door still hung squarely on its hinges. A large metal rain barrel beside the cabin held several inches of clean water collected from earlier storms. Jack quietly thanked every ranger who had once maintained this forgotten place. Inside, the station felt simple but solid. Wooden shelves lined one wall beside an old desk covered with faded maps. A compact wood stove stood in the corner beneath a stone chimney. Emergency blankets, basic first aid supplies, several flashlights, extra batteries, and sealed containers of drinking water remained neatly organized inside a storage cabinet. Everything suggested that although few visitors came anymore, someone had cared enough to leave the station ready for emergencies. Emma slowly turned. In a circle, taking in every detail. It feels like somebody wanted people to find this place. Jack gently nodded. The best rangers always think about the people they may never meet. He walked toward the radio sitting on the desk. Dust covered the controls, but the equipment appeared complete. He carefully inspected every cable before connecting the backup battery mounted beneath the table. A small green indicator light flickered once before glowing steadily. Emma watched with growing excitement. Does that mean it works? Jack adjusted the volume and listened. At first, there was only static. Then, faint voices drifted through the speaker before disappearing again beneath the crackling interference. His heartbeat remained calm, but inside he felt the first genuine wave of hope all day. He slowly adjusted the frequency one notch at a time until another distant transmission became slightly clearer. The words were still impossible to understand, yet they proved one important thing. Somewhere beyond the smoke, other people were searching. Jack picked up the microphone, waited patiently for a clear break in the static, and pressed the transmit button. Speaking slowly and clearly, he identified himself, gave the approximate location of the ranger station, described that he and his daughter were safe for the moment, and requested confirmation that anyone could hear his signal. He released the button and listened. Silence filled the small cabin except for the gentle hiss of the radio and the distant whisper of the wind outside. Emma looked at him with quiet hope. Before either of them could say another word, the speaker suddenly crackled to life with the faint sound of a human voice struggling through the static. Jack immediately reached for the volume control, carefully turning the dial until the faint voice became slightly clearer through the layers of static. The signal faded, returned, then disappeared again beneath a burst of interference. He remained completely still, refusing to interrupt. Experience had taught him that patience often revealed what urgency concealed. Emma stood beside him with both hands wrapped around her water bottle, her eyes fixed on the old radio as though willing the invisible voice to become stronger. Finally, another burst of sound broke through. Unidentified station, repeat your location. The words arrived broken apart, but they were unmistakably human. Jack calmly picked up the microphone once more. This is Jack Carter. I am with my 10-year-old daughter. We are at the Old Granite Ridge Ranger Station. We are safe inside the building. We have drinking water and emergency supplies. Please confirm you copy. He released the transmit button and listened. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity before another wave of static rolled through the speaker. Then a stronger voice answered. Jack Carter, we copy your transmission. Remain inside. Rescue teams are moving as conditions allow. Emma looked at her father with wide, hopeful eyes. They heard us. Jack smiled gently and squeezed her shoulder. Yes, they know where we are now. Relief settled quietly across the small cabin, but Jack understood their journey was not over. Rescue teams still had to navigate dangerous terrain, changing winds, and heavy smoke before they could safely reach the station. Knowing help was coming did not mean they could stop making careful decisions. He checked every window to make sure they remained closed against drifting smoke before inspecting the emergency supplies more closely. The storage cabinet held enough bottled water, energy bars, canned soup, matches, batteries, and medical supplies to support travelers for several days if everything was used carefully. Emma watched him organize the supplies into neat groups across the wooden table. You always make everything look easy, she said softly. Jack smiled without looking up. It only looks easy because someone prepared before the emergency happened. Emma glanced around the cabin again. The ranger who left these things prepared too. Jack nodded with quiet respect. Exactly. Kindness is often something people leave behind for strangers they will never meet. Those words lingered in the peaceful silence. Outside, the distant roar of the wildfire continued beyond the granite ridge, but the open landscape surrounding the station prevented the flames from approaching directly. Smoke still drifted overhead, dimming the evening light, yet the sturdy cabin remained calm inside. Jack filled a small pot with clean water from the rain barrel outside and warmed canned soup on the compact wood stove. The familiar smell of hot food slowly replaced the scent of smoke that had followed them throughout the day. Emma smiled as she wrapped both hands around the warm bowl. "This is the best soup I have ever tasted." Jack laughed quietly. Hunger has a way of improving every recipe. They shared a simple meal while listening to the occasional crackle from the radio. Every 30 minutes, Jack checked in with the rescue team, each conversation becoming slightly clearer as atmospheric conditions shifted. The rescue coordinator explained that several roads had been closed, helicopters faced limited visibility, and ground crews were carefully working toward isolated locations throughout the national forest. Jack thanked them for the update and promised they would remain inside the ranger station unless conditions changed dramatically. As darkness settled across the mountains, the smoky sky outside slowly gave way to scattered stars appearing through small openings above the drifting haze. Emma stepped onto the wooden porch beside her father. The air felt cooler now, carrying only a faint trace of smoke. They looked across the quiet valley where tiny points of light moved slowly in the distance. Jack recognized them immediately. Emergency vehicles were advancing along mountain roads far below. Emma whispered, "They look like little stars." Jack smiled. "Every one of those lights belongs to someone helping another family tonight." Emma leaned gently against his shoulder. "Do you think we will remember this day forever?" Jack looked toward the dark silhouette of the mountains before answering. "I think we will remember what this day taught us." She looked up at him. "What did it teach you?" He remained silent for a moment before speaking. "That the strongest survival skill is not building a fire or reading a map. It is staying calm long enough to make the next good decision." Emma quietly nodded, understanding those words in a deeper way than ever before. Just then the radio inside the cabin crackled again, this time with a stronger signal than any they had heard all evening. A calm voice announced that a rescue team had reached the final access trail below Granite Ridge and would arrive at the station shortly after sunrise if weather conditions continued to improve. Jack looked toward the first faint glow beginning to appear beyond the eastern horizon, realizing that after the longest day of their lives, hope was no longer somewhere in the distance. It was already climbing over the mountains with the coming dawn. Jack woke before the first rays of sunlight reached the mountains. Years of working outdoors had trained his body to wake naturally whenever daylight approached, even after the exhausting journey of the previous day. He quietly stepped onto the wooden porch of the ranger station while Emma continued sleeping peacefully beneath one of the emergency blankets. The cool morning air carried only the faintest trace of smoke. Above him, the sky was no longer hidden beneath the heavy copper haze that had covered the mountains the day before. Patches of soft blue slowly expanded across the horizon as the sunrise painted the distant peaks with warm golden light. Jack stood silently, listening. The roaring sound that had dominated every moment of the previous afternoon had faded into a distant murmur. Birds had not yet returned, but somewhere below the ridge he heard the gentle flow of water moving through the seasonal creek. Nature was beginning to breathe again. He closed his eyes for one brief moment and quietly thanked everyone who had built and maintained the forgotten ranger station over the years. Without their quiet dedication, yesterday could have ended very differently. Behind him, the old radio suddenly crackled to life. Jack stepped inside and lifted the microphone. A clear voice greeted him with far less interference than before. "Granite Ridge Ranger Station. This is Rescue Team 3. We are approximately 1 mile from your location. Conditions continue to improve. Please remain where you are. We expect to reach you within 30 minutes." Jack smiled. "Copy that, Rescue Team 3. We will remain at the station." Emma slowly opened her eyes after hearing her father's voice. "Are they close?" she asked while rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Jack nodded warmly. "Very close." Her face brightened immediately. She folded the emergency blanket with the same care her father always showed toward borrowed equipment before helping him tidy the cabin. Together they washed their bowls, organized the remaining supplies, and left everything exactly as they had found it. Emma noticed her father carefully writing a short note inside the station logbook resting on the old desk. "What are you writing?" she asked. Jack smiled as he finished the final sentence. "Just a thank you." She looked at the page. "To who?" Jack gently closed the weathered book. "Sometimes we never meet the people whose kindness changes our lives. That does not mean they should go unthanked." A few minutes later, the peaceful morning was interrupted by the distant sound of engines climbing the narrow mountain trail below the station. Emma hurried to the porch beside her father. Between scattered pine trees, 3 search and rescue vehicles slowly appeared, carefully navigating the rocky access road before stopping near the clearing. Several uniformed rescuers stepped out, removing their helmets as they approached with relaxed smiles. The team leader, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Mitchell, extended her hand toward Jack. "You must be Jack Carter." Jack shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for coming." Sarah smiled. "We should be thanking you. Your radio messages were calm, clear, and incredibly helpful. They made locating you much easier." She glanced toward Emma. "And you must be Emma." Emma smiled shyly. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah knelt slightly so they were at eye level. "Your father made some excellent decisions yesterday. Both of you did." Another rescuer walked around the station, quietly inspecting the surrounding terrain before returning with an impressed expression. "You picked exactly the right route," he said to Jack. "Most people would have tried reaching the main highway. You moved toward open granite and the old burn scar. Instead, that probably made all the difference." Jack shrugged modestly. "The mountain showed us the safest path. We simply paid attention." Sarah looked across the landscape where scattered smoke still drifted beyond the distant ridges. Not everyone stays calm enough to notice what nature is trying to say. Emma looked proudly at her father, but Jack gently placed one hand on her shoulder before answering. "She deserves just as much credit. She trusted every decision, stayed calm, and remembered every lesson we practiced." Sarah smiled at Emma. "That is something to be proud of." Before leaving, Jack walked back inside the ranger station one final time. He placed the cabin key exactly where he had found it, checked that every window was secure, and gently rested his hand on the old wooden door before closing it behind him. The forgotten station had quietly protected another family, just as it had been built to do many years before. As the rescue vehicles slowly descended the mountain road, Emma looked back through the rear window until the little cabin disappeared behind the trees. "Do you think someone else will need it someday?" she asked softly. Jack followed her gaze toward the quiet ridge growing smaller behind them. "I hope if they ever do, they will find it waiting just like we did." The drive back to town felt almost unreal after everything they had experienced. As the rescue vehicles wound their way down the mountain roads, the landscape slowly transformed. The thick smoke that had hidden the sky the day before gave way to patches of bright blue, and the morning sun reflected gently across distant hills where untouched forests still stood tall. Jack sat quietly beside Emma, watching the mountains disappear through the window. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with conversation. Sometimes the deepest gratitude arrived without words. When they reached the emergency response center near the edge of town, volunteers welcomed every family with warm meals, fresh water, and reassuring smiles. The atmosphere was calm and organized. People greeted one another with relief, neighbors embraced, and rescue workers continued checking names against arrival lists with quiet professionalism. Emma accepted a warm blanket from one volunteer while another offered Jack a cup of fresh coffee. He thanked them both with the same sincere smile he had shown every person they had met since leaving the ranger station. Sarah Mitchell joined them a few minutes later carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. "We have already contacted your relatives," she said. "Everyone knows you are safe." Jack nodded gratefully. "Thank you for everything your team did." Sarah smiled. "You made our job much easier than you probably realize." She paused before continuing. "Several experienced firefighters reviewed the route you described over the radio. They all reached the same conclusion. Your decisions consistently moved toward lower fuel areas, natural fire breaks, and open granite. That level of judgment under pressure is rare." Jack lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. The mountain had all the answers. I simply remembered what it had taught me over the years. Sarah looked toward Emma. And she remembered everything you taught her. Emma smiled quietly, a little embarrassed by the attention. Later that afternoon, local officials gathered rescued families for a brief community update. They explained that emergency crews had successfully protected many homes while firefighters continued strengthening containment lines around the largest sections of the wildfire. The message offered hope without making promises, and the room responded with respectful applause for every responder still working in the mountains. As people slowly returned to their conversations, an older park superintendent named William Harper approached Jack. His silver ranger badge reflected softly beneath the overhead lights. "You're Jack Carter?" he asked warmly. Jack stood and shook his hand. "Yes, sir." William smiled. "I have been looking through some very old records this morning." Jack listened with quiet curiosity. "That ranger station where you sheltered was scheduled to be removed years ago. A retired ranger convinced the department to keep it maintained as an emergency refuge for hikers and search teams. He always believed someone would need it. Again someday." William glanced toward Emma before continuing. "Looks like he was right." Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude settle over him. He remembered the carefully organized supplies, the working radio, the clean rain barrel, and the simple logbook resting on the old desk. Every thoughtful detail had been prepared by people who expected nothing in return. Emma smiled as she looked up at William. "My dad left a thank you in the logbook." The older ranger's eyes softened. "Then someday another ranger will read those words and know that their work mattered." News of Jack and Emma's survival quietly spread throughout the community over the following days. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers stopped by simply to shake Jack's hand or tell Emma how proud they were of her courage. Reporters requested interviews, but Jack politely declined most of them. He believed the real story belonged to the firefighters, rescue crews, volunteers, and every person who had quietly prepared for emergencies long before anyone needed help. When one local newspaper finally asked him what had saved their lives, he answered with only one sentence: preparation, calm decisions, and people who cared enough to help someone they had never met. That simple answer appeared on the front page the following morning. Emma clipped the newspaper and folded it carefully into her scrapbook beside photographs from happier family camping trips. Looking at the pictures, she realized that every ordinary weekend her father had spent teaching her how to read the wind, respect nature, conserve water, and stay calm had never been ordinary at all. They had quietly become the foundation that carried them safely through the most difficult day of their lives. As the sun began setting beyond the town that evening, Jack and Emma stood together on the porch of their home, watching the distant mountains glowing beneath soft golden light. Smoke still lingered along parts of the horizon, but above it stretched a clear blue sky that seemed brighter than either of them remembered. Emma slipped her hand into her father's once again. Jack gently held it, smiling as they looked toward the mountains with hearts no longer filled by fear, but by quiet respect for the lessons that only patience, preparation, kindness, and hope could ever teach. Spring arrived quietly in the mountains, almost as though the wilderness wanted to remind everyone that even the darkest seasons eventually gave way to new beginnings. Several months had passed since Jack and Emma walked through smoke beneath an amber sky, yet the lessons from those long hours remained part of their daily lives. On a cool Saturday morning, they loaded their old pickup truck with a young pine tree, 2 shovels, a small watering can, and a picnic basket before driving back toward the national forest. Much of the landscape had already begun to change. Fresh green grass covered the valleys, wildflowers appeared beside winding creeks, and thousands of tiny pine seedlings stretched toward the sunlight from ground that had once looked lifeless. Emma rolled down her window and smiled as the clean mountain air filled the truck. "It smells different," she said. Jack nodded. "The forest is healing." They followed the familiar mountain road until they reached the old trail leading toward Granite Ridge. This time there was no smoke hiding the sky, no drifting ash, and no distant roar echoing across the hills. Birds sang from the treetops once again, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine across the open slopes. As they hiked toward the ranger station, Emma noticed how many small signs of life had quietly returned. Bright green ferns covered the edges of the old burn scar. Tiny wildflowers grew between weathered rocks. Even the blackened tree trunks now stood beside young saplings reaching confidently toward the light. Jack smiled as he watched Emma stop every few steps to admire another new beginning. "Nature keeps its promises," he said softly. "It always tries again." The old ranger station stood exactly where they had left it. Fresh paint covered the front porch, the roof had been repaired, and a new American flag gently moved in the breeze above the restored radio antenna. Park Superintendent William Harper stepped outside with a welcoming smile as they approached. "I hoped you might come back someday," he said, while shaking Jack's hand. Emma ran over and gave the older ranger a warm hug. William laughed kindly before leading them toward the edge of the clearing where several new pine trees had already been planted by volunteers from the surrounding communities. "After your story spread through the county," he explained, "people wanted to help restore this place. More emergency supplies were donated, the radio system was upgraded, and hikers have even started volunteering to maintain the trail." Jack quietly looked around the station with grateful eyes. One act of preparation inspired another. William nodded. That is usually how real kindness works. Together they carried the young pine tree to an open space overlooking the broad granite ridge where Jack and Emma had first spotted the cabin months earlier. Father and daughter knelt side by side, carefully digging into the soft spring soil. Emma gently lowered the small tree into the ground while Jack filled the hole around its roots. When they finished, they poured fresh water over the newly planted earth and stood together in comfortable silence. The little tree swayed gently beneath the warm mountain breeze, its bright green needles shining beneath the afternoon sun. Emma slipped her hand into her father's once more. "Do you think this tree will still be here when I am grown up?" she asked. Jack looked at the tiny evergreen before answering with a peaceful smile. "If people continue caring for this forest the way others cared for us, I believe it will stand here for generations." Before leaving, Emma walked inside the ranger station and opened the weathered logbook resting on the same wooden desk. She carefully turned through the pages until she found her father's handwritten thank you from months before. Beneath it were dozens of new messages left by hikers, volunteers, firefighters, and families who had visited since then. Some thanked the unknown rangers who had maintained the station for so many years. Others promised to protect the forest for future generations. Emma picked up the pen and added one final sentence beneath the growing collection of signatures. "Kindness always leaves the trail easier for the next traveler." Jack quietly read her words before placing one proud hand on her shoulder. As they walked back toward the truck beneath a bright blue sky, neither of them looked at the mountains with fear anymore. They looked with respect, gratitude, and quiet confidence. Jack knew that survival had never been only about finding shelter, reading the wind, or choosing the safest path across the mountain. The greatest lesson had always been much simpler. Stay calm. Keep learning. Help others whenever you can. Trust the people who quietly prepare for strangers they may never meet. Because in every season of life, hope grows the same way forests do, one patient day at a time, one small act of kindness after another, until what once seemed impossible becomes the beginning of something beautiful.